Imagine reaching a moment in your life when pretending simply becomes impossible. The masks you've carefully worn for years suddenly feel unbearable, like clothes that no longer fit. The roles you've played, the game society expects you to participate in, start to look painfully obvious. The life you've built, once a source of stability, now feels like a prison constructed from other people's expectations. This shift doesn't mean you're depressed or broken. It means you're waking up. And with that awakening comes an unavoidable process of releasing everything that no longer reflects who you truly are. Carl Jung devoted much of his life to studying this transformation. He observed countless people going through a deep spiritual reorientation. And he noticed something consistent. Authentic growth is rarely about dramatic gestures or overnight revolutions. Instead, it happens slowly, like a quiet unraveling. It's not about deciding, "Today I will quit this." It's more like your entire being begins rejecting what no longer matches your inner truth. Patterns that once felt necessary for survival start to feel suffocating. You don't consciously quit them. You simply discover one day that you can't tolerate them anymore. Jung described it as a kind of allergic reaction to inauthenticity. The clearer your inner world becomes, the less able you are to continue old habits that once defined you. If you've been feeling like the world around you no longer fits, that you can't engage with life the way you used to, you're not alone. This inner resistance is not failure, it's transformation. The first attachment people slowly release is the relentless craving for approval. Jung noted that this isn't a matter of willpower. It's more like something inside your psychological framework shifts. And suddenly, the act of seeking validation feels physically uncomfortable. Think of it like this. Imagine eating sugar your whole life, only to wake up one day with an intolerance to it. The thing you once depended on now makes you ill. That's what happens with approval. You might find yourself in a meeting, about to say what others want to hear, and suddenly your body refuses. Your throat tightens. The words won't come out. Maybe even your palms sweat. This isn't anxiety. It's your authentic self drawing a hard boundary, refusing to play the game anymore. Jung documented real cases of this happening. A woman who once lived entirely for her mother's praise found herself unable to continue the cycle. She'd pick up the phone to seek reassurance, but her hands would literally tremble. A man who had built his identity on professional recognition suddenly realized promotions and titles no longer held meaning for him. At first, this creates an awkward in-between stage. You stop fishing for compliments, but still notice when they're absent. You stop posting for attention, but still check your phone out of habit. You're caught between two worlds. The old identity that fed on approval and the new self that no longer needs it. And yet, as the hunger for validation dies, something far more valuable is born, an inner authority, a deep sense of worth that comes not from others, but from within. This transition can feel like withdrawal. For years, your nervous system has been wired to chase acknowledgement from parents, partners, bosses, or friends. Letting go isn't smooth, it's messy. Jung compared it to losing an identity, because approval isn't just about behavior, it's about who you've believed yourself to be. When that collapses, you experience both grief and liberation at the same time. One patient Jung observed described it perfectly. "I used to rearrange my entire personality depending on who I was with. Now, when I try, it's as if my soul pulls an emergency brake. I just can't do it anymore." That internal refusal becomes stronger over time. At first, you might still feel the impulse to people please, but you notice it's harder to follow through. Eventually, the urge itself weakens until it disappears. Jung noticed that this quitting happens in layers. People often release the need for approval from strangers first. Random people online, casual acquaintances, colleagues. Then the circle tightens. Approval from friends starts losing its grip. The hardest and final step is releasing the need for approval from family, especially parents. This stage often feels like betrayal, but in truth, it's liberation. The reward for enduring this process is profound. Without the exhausting need to prove yourself, you start to feel a new kind of wholeness. It's not confidence in the traditional sense, which still references others. It's worth a sense of being complete in and of yourself, like a tree tapping into groundwater. You no longer depend on external rain to survive. This shift is why genuinely spiritual people often appear mysteriously unshakable. They're not trying to radiate confidence. They simply no longer play the endless game of proving their existence through the eyes of others. They've discovered what Jung called inner authority, a compass that points true regardless of public opinion. But releasing the need for approval is only the first step. Another surprising transformation Jung identified is the quiet abandonment of the need to be special. At first, this seems paradoxical. Isn't spiritual growth supposed to affirm how unique you are? In truth, there's a profound difference between embracing your uniqueness and needing to be seen as extraordinary. Early in spiritual awakening, many people fall into what Jung described as spiritual inflation. They have an authentic mystical experience, a sudden insight during meditation, a synchronicity, a moment of clarity, and for a time, they feel chosen. They subtly, or not so subtly, position themselves as superior. The one who knows, the one who sees beyond the veil. This stage is common and almost unavoidable. You might find yourself dropping hints about your consciousness level, your spiritual practices, or your insights. You're not openly bragging, but there's a quiet sense of wanting others to notice your elevated state. Yet, as the journey deepens, something shifts. That hunger to be special becomes heavy, artificial, even embarrassing. What once felt like wings starts to feel like chains. Jung witnessed this countless times. The need to be seen as enlightened gradually dissolves, leaving behind a more grounded, authentic individuality. Jung once treated a man who had built his entire identity around being the spiritual one. He was the friend everyone came to for wisdom, the one who always had the deepest insights, the most disciplined practices, the longest meditations. For years, this identity gave him purpose. But one day, in the middle of explaining some profound concept, he suddenly froze. Later, he admitted, "I saw myself from the outside, and I looked ridiculous. I wasn't sharing wisdom. I was performing spirituality to feel special." And that performance was the exact opposite of real spirituality. This recognition marked the beginning of his slow release. Each time he tried to highlight his advanced practices or insights, something in him resisted. It became harder to continue the performance. Eventually, he stopped trying to showcase his spiritual superiority at all. This quitting doesn't happen overnight. At first, you catch yourself preparing to mention your meditation streak or your synchronicities, and you pull back. You notice when you're about to signal how awake you are compared to others, and you stop mid-sentence. Slowly, the performance fades. The transformation is profound. You become comfortable being ordinary, not ordinary in a dull sense, but ordinary in the sense of not needing recognition. One woman described her process beautifully. "I used to need people to know I was deeper, more conscious, different. Now, I'm content being invisible. Trying to be special was a prison. Being nobody is freedom." And here's the paradox Jung found fascinating. When people stop trying to be special, their true uniqueness shines through more clearly than ever. Not the kind of uniqueness performed for others, but the genuine kind that arises from authenticity. You stop blooming for an audience. You bloom simply because blooming is your nature. Jung called this stage individuation without inflation. It means becoming fully yourself without needing to prove it, without attaching superiority to it. Like a flower, you don't bloom to be admired. You bloom because that's what you were made to do. For the ego, this stage is terrifying. The ego asks, if I'm not special, then who am I? The answer, which can take years to fully embrace, is disarmingly simple. You are you, and that is more than enough. After approval and specialness fall away, another layer comes into focus: the performance of happiness. This one surprises many seekers. Shouldn't spiritual awakening make you perpetually joyful, beyond struggle, radiating peace and positivity at all times? Jung's answer was clear. No, genuine spiritual growth doesn't erase pain. It makes you more real. Realness means embracing the full range of human experience: joy and grief, clarity and confusion, peace and turmoil. Pretending to be happy all the time, Jung warned, is just another mask. One of the most deceptive masks of all. In modern culture, especially within spiritual communities, there's immense pressure to appear endlessly positive. You're expected to radiate light, to rise above negative emotions, to remain unshaken by grief, anger, or fear. The assumption is that true spirituality means being untouched by pain. But Jung observed that this performance of happiness is not only exhausting, it's anti-spiritual. Why? Because it denies reality. Authentic growth doesn't mean floating above human suffering. It means embracing the whole of it: light and shadow, peace and conflict, laughter and tears, all are part of the same tapestry. To deny half of it is to live in half-truth. Jung once supervised a therapist who embodied this struggle. She had built her entire practice around being the calm, enlightened healer. Clients admired her serenity, her eternal positivity, her unshakable center. But when her son tragically died, she found she could no longer perform that role. She tried to return to work, but every time she put on her serene mask, tears would break through. Eventually, she told Jung, "I thought being spiritual meant transcending human pain. Now I realize it means embracing it. I can't be the enlightened one anymore. I can only be the real one." This awakening is a difficult but liberating shift. Instead of suppressing grief with affirmations or forcing smiles when life feels unbearable, you allow yourself to be fully human. You stop bypassing your suffering and begin integrating it. Spirituality ceases to be a performance and becomes embodiment, a way of inhabiting your truth, however messy it may be. This does not mean abandoning joy. In fact, Jung found that when people quit the performance of happiness, genuine joy arises more freely. It's no longer staged or forced. It emerges naturally from authenticity. Smiles return, not because you're trying to be spiritual, but because you've allowed space for real emotions to move through you. If you recognize yourself in this stage, struggling to maintain positivity, feeling like you're failing because you can't be radiant all the time, know this: you are not failing, you are growing. The collapse of the performance is a sign of maturity. Before we move on, it's worth noting that Jung's insights here are echoed in many traditions. Buddhism speaks of impermanence, the inevitability of joy and sorrow cycling through. Christianity emphasizes the cross before resurrection. Psychology itself recognizes that suppressing emotions only makes them stronger. What Jung identified is not a rejection of happiness, but a fuller embrace of reality. As this shift deepens, people often find themselves becoming gentler with others too. When you no longer demand constant happiness of yourself, you stop demanding it from others. You can sit with someone in pain without rushing to fix them, without plastering positivity over their suffering. This capacity to hold space without pretense is one of the clearest signs of spiritual maturity. And just as releasing approval leads to inner worth, and letting go of specialness reveals authentic uniqueness, quitting the performance of happiness leads to true presence. As Jung mapped this unfolding, he noticed a fourth pattern that spiritual seekers inevitably release: the obsession with certainty. At first glance, this seems strange. Don't we pursue spirituality to find answers? To gain clarity about who we are, why we're here, what happens after death? Yet, the deeper people grow, the less they cling to certainty. Instead, they become more comfortable with mystery. Most of us spend our lives collecting certainties like armor. I know who I am. I know what's right. I know how the world works. I know what comes after life. These beliefs create a sense of safety, a foundation to stand on. But Jung found that these certainties often act more like cages than anchors. The tighter we grip them, the smaller our experience of life becomes. He described the case of a brilliant physicist who entered therapy in crisis. For years, he had relied on his scientific worldview to explain everything. But a profound spiritual awakening shattered his intellectual framework. He confessed, "I used to know how the universe worked. Now I realize I don't even know how my coffee cup works. The more conscious I become, the less certain I am about anything." This wasn't confusion, it was clarity. He was awakening to the reality that truth is fluid, not fixed. The moment you try to trap it in a concept, it dies and turns into dogma. Jung guided him through the slow and agonizing process of releasing the need for absolute knowing. First, he let go of certainty about how things work, then about why things happen. Eventually, he even released certainty about his own identity. Jung called this stage the cloud of unknowing. It's not about being lost. It's about discovering freedom in not needing to know. People who reach this stage learn to hold paradox, to believe two seemingly contradictory things at once, to act decisively without guarantees, to commit fully while remaining open to being wrong. This isn't weakness, it's spiritual maturity. A woman undergoing this transition described her experience simply: "I used to have strong opinions about everything: politics, relationships, faith. Now, when people ask what I believe, I honestly don't know, and it feels like relief, not failure. Every certainty I let go of creates space for something more beautiful. Presence with what is." Letting go of certainty terrifies the ego, because the ego thrives on being right. But beyond that fear lies liberation. Once you release the desperate grip on knowing, you open yourself to wonder. Instead of rigid answers, you find curiosity. Instead of unshakable opinions, you cultivate openness. Instead of fear of the unknown, you discover reverence for mystery. This is why spiritual growth doesn't necessarily make people know-it-alls. Quite the opposite. It makes them humble, receptive, and able to sit in the vastness of life without needing to explain it all away. As the grip on certainty loosens, another deeply ingrained pattern begins to dissolve: blame. Jung noticed that highly spiritual people eventually release the entire victim-perpetrator narrative that the ego depends on to make sense of suffering. Blame feels natural at first. When we're hurt, betrayed, or mistreated, pointing to someone else as the cause gives us clarity and even comfort. Blame preserves our innocence, explains our pain, and gives us an identity. But Jung warned that over time, this identity can become a prison. When we define ourselves by what others have done to us, we remain stuck in their shadow. He described the case of a woman who had endured significant trauma, an abusive childhood, a deceitful partner, discriminatory employers. Her anger was justified. Her stories of mistreatment were accurate. But Jung saw that her attachment to blame was slowly destroying her. She was so identified with being wronged that she could no longer imagine a life beyond her suffering. Through years of work, she began to see a pattern. Yes, people had harmed her, but she also unconsciously placed herself in situations that reinforced her identity as a victim. She later admitted, "The day I stopped blaming was the day I became free. Not because those people weren't wrong, they were, but because I finally saw that holding on to blame was my choice. I was using their actions as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for my own life." This shift doesn't happen quickly. Jung outlined several stages of quitting blame. First comes rage at the unfairness. This shouldn't have happened. Then comes recognition. This keeps happening. Later, there's a painful acknowledgement. Somehow, I've participated in these patterns. Finally, a new stance emerges. I am the author of my experience. One man, for example, had spent decades blaming his father for his struggles. But when he confronted his patterns, he realized he had turned his father into a monster in order to avoid looking at his own shadows. The day he quit blaming, he saw his father clearly for the first time, not as a villain, but as another wounded human doing his best with limited tools. And in that moment, he saw himself clearly too, not as a victim, but as a soul who had chosen this father as part of his own evolution. Releasing blame doesn't mean excusing harm or staying in abusive situations. It doesn't mean denying pain. Instead, it means reclaiming your power. When you stop blaming, you stop outsourcing responsibility for your story. You begin to see that even your wounds can serve your awakening. This stage is excruciating for the ego, which thrives on pointing fingers. But for the soul, it is pure liberation. Without blame, you are no longer trapped in endless replays of the past. You step into authorship, into power, into freedom. Once the chains of blame begin to fall away, another subtle but powerful shift takes place: the abandonment of spiritual bypassing. Jung saw this repeatedly in spiritual communities. People using lofty ideas and practices not to deepen their humanity, but to escape it. Spiritual bypassing can take many forms. Meditation used to avoid difficult emotions. Phrases like, "everything happens for a reason," used to cover up grief. Ideals like, "we're all one," used to ignore healthy boundaries. Even the pursuit of enlightenment itself can become a way to avoid facing unresolved wounds. Jung encountered a Buddhist practitioner who exemplified this trap. After 2 decades of disciplined practice, the man had reached profound states of emptiness. He had touched the void, dissolved his ego, and experienced remarkable detachment. Yet, his personal life was in ruins. His relationships were shallow, his emotions were numbed, and he had become dissociated from the very essence of being human. He had used enlightenment not as integration, but as escape. The process of quitting bypassing was, for him, more painful than his initial awakening. He had to come back down into his body, into his feelings, into his ordinary human needs. After spending years trying to dissolve the self, he had to rebuild a healthy one. He later admitted, "I thought spirituality was about transcending being human. Now I see it's about fully living my humanity. I spent 20 years trying to be nobody. Now I'm learning to be somebody, this particular person, with these wounds and these gifts." This transition is not easy. It requires admitting uncomfortable truths. That you still feel anger, even when you understand others are doing their best. That you still want intimacy, even though, on a cosmic level, we are already connected. That you still have fears, even though you trust the universe. The maturity lies in allowing both realities to exist side by side. Jung emphasized that genuine spirituality isn't about escaping the human condition. It's about embodying it. It's about standing at the intersection of heaven and earth, infinity and finiteness, spirit and flesh. To bypass is to run from life. To embody is to finally live it. As people quit bypassing, something beautiful emerges. Wholeness. Instead of being split between a spiritual self and a human self, they integrate. They stop running from their wounds and instead use them as doorways to deeper connection. They stop rejecting their desires and instead see them as expressions of life, moving through them. This is the paradox Jung loved to highlight. The more fully human you allow yourself to be, the more fully spiritual you become. The two are not opposites, they are partners. And once bypassing is released, there remains one final layer, the illusion that awakening means isolation. Jung observed that many seekers, after shedding approval, specialness, performance, certainty, blame, and bypassing, find themselves facing one last illusion: the belief that awakening means separation. At first, it feels noble, even inevitable. You've seen truths others haven't. You've touched depths others cannot reach. You wonder, how could I possibly connect with people who are still asleep? For a time, solitude feels necessary. Many spend months or even years withdrawing, convinced that spiritual growth demands isolation. But Jung discovered something remarkable. Genuine maturity eventually brings people back into connection, but of a very different quality. Not unconscious merging, but conscious meeting. Not the comfort of sameness, but the beauty of seeing and being seen. One woman Jung worked with spent years in spiritual solitude. She believed she was simply too conscious to connect with ordinary people. But eventually, she realized her isolation wasn't a mark of enlightenment. It was fear. Fear of being seen in her raw humanity. Fear of admitting she still stumbled, still hurt, still had shadows. Her separation was less about consciousness and more about pride. When she let that go, everything shifted. She found she could connect with anyone, not by lowering her awareness, but by embracing her humanity. She could sit with unconscious people without judgment, because she recognized her own unconsciousness too. She could love those still asleep, because she remembered her own long sleep. In her words, "My awakening didn't separate me, it opened me. I thought I was alone because I was advanced. Now I see I was alone because I was afraid." Jung described this stage as the birth of conscious community. It's not about returning to shallow social roles, but about finding others who are also releasing illusions. Together, such people form connections based not on need, but on authenticity. They can love without attachment, share truth without preaching, be intimate without losing themselves. And so, the journey of spiritual quitting comes full circle. What looks like loss from the outside is actually liberation. Each layer that falls away reveals something more authentic. Approval-seeking dissolves into inner worth. Specialness melts into true uniqueness. Performance drops into presence. Certainty gives way to wisdom. Blame transforms into power. Bypassing evolves into embodiment. Isolation unfolds into conscious connection. The process is slow, often stretching across years or decades. You release, then grip again. You let go, then return to old habits. But each cycle weakens the attachment. Each return is softer than before. Jung reminded his patients that this is not failure. It is the spiral of growth. If you find yourself somewhere on this path, quitting old patterns, grieving old identities, feeling both lost and found, remember this: you are not alone. Around the world, countless others are awakening, releasing, and rediscovering themselves too. Your task is not to rush the process, but to witness it, to notice what's falling away, to honor what's dying, and to celebrate what is being born. Every release is a revelation. Every letting go is a homecoming. And as you continue, know that the very things you thought you needed most were never the truth of who you are. You don't become someone new. You simply quit being who you're not. So if this journey resonates with you, support our channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Join our growing community of awakening souls, and let's walk this path of release and rediscovery together.